Born into poverty, raised by vision. Born in silence. Not everyone is born to the sound of applause. Some of us, like me, begin life with nothing but the sound of rain dripping through a broken roof and the silence of grown-ups who are too tired to speak. I don't remember the moment I was born. No one really does, but I've been told the story, and I've replayed it in my mind many times. My mother gave birth to me in a cramped room on the outskirts of Santo Domingo. The floor was hardened dirt, the walls were flaking plaster, and the roof leaked even when the rain was light. There was no doctor, no nurse, no dramatic gasps like in the movies, just a neighbor bringing over a worn towel and a pot of boiled water. My father didn't say a word. He wasn't the emotional type, but that day, my mother told me, he stood still for a long time. Not in awe, in fear, afraid she wouldn't make it, afraid he couldn't afford milk for the newborn son lying in her arms. There was no celebration, no bright light, no triumphant cry that echoed into the future. Just another event tucked into the daily struggle of a poor neighborhood where survival always took priority over ceremony. As I grew older, I used to envy children who had baby albums, birthday candles, and stories told about them at dinner. I had none of that. Only an old blanket my mother had saved, the only proof I was once small. And the quiet stories she told me, gentle words that made me wonder, if I entered this world in silence, could I still live a life that echoes? Eventually, I found the answer. You don't choose where you're born, but you can choose how you walk away from it. And sometimes, the quietest beginnings lead to the loudest destinies. The walls without windows. The place I grew up in could hardly be called a house. It was more of a shelter, temporary, improvised, patched together to resemble something stable. 4 leaning walls, a rusted tin roof, no window. Not because someone forgot to build it, because no one in my family had the means to think it mattered. I spent hours lying on the cold floor, eyes fixed on the stains above. The ceiling became my sky. Every patch of mold, every crack across the wall, looked to me like something greater, rivers on a map, secret roads, constellations waiting to be named. I had never seen a telescope, hadn't read about the universe, but I felt drawn to it like it whispered to me, even when no one else did. The most consistent sound in my childhood was the rhythm of my mother's sewing machine. Steady at first, then halting when the needle snapped or the thread jammed. She didn't curse loudly, just sighed, weary. No one complains too long when complaint fixes nothing. In the evenings, my father tried to repair an old fan that rattled more than it blew air. His hands fumbled with melted wires, but he kept going. Fixing the fan wasn't about the breeze. It was about proving he still had control over something, anything. Our home was narrow, but my inner world, wide. There were no books, no toys, no stories told aloud. What I had was time, and a mind that refused to stop asking. Instead of playing with other children, I scavenged for scraps of wrapping paper discarded in the marketplace. That's where I made my first letters imitating shapes I had seen, guessing sounds. The writing was crooked, the thoughts were not. At an age when most children were learning how to speak clearly, I was afraid of forgetting my own thoughts. So I wrote in paper, on walls, on dirt. My parents never read what I wrote, not because they didn't care, but because, in their world, feeding a child mattered more than understanding what he thought. I never blamed them. They did what they could with what they had. One day I asked my mother, Why don't we have a window like the house next door?" She paused, then said quietly, "What's the point? Nothing to see out there. Just more of what we don't have." I stayed silent, but the question never left me. Later, I realized windows aren't made with wood and glass. They're built with hope. And when adults stop hoping, they stop building. Even in a room without windows, I saw a world beyond. In mold stains, I saw maps. In broken sounds, I heard rhythms. In silence, I found voices of something waiting beyond these walls. No one told me to think differently. No one praised me for it. But somewhere deep down, I knew I wasn't born to remain inside these walls. Where there was no view, I made one. Where there was no light, I noticed every flicker. Where there was no story, I began to write my own. Some call poverty a prison. I call it a backdrop. You don't choose it, but you choose what kind of picture you paint over it. Inside a room, no one saw. I was a quiet child, not out of fear or shyness, but because no one seemed to be listening. In a house smaller than 20 square meters, filled with grown-up arguments about groceries and the buzz of mosquitoes at night, the voice of a child didn't matter much. Early on, I learned silence. Not to please anyone, but to avoid disturbing those already overwhelmed. My mother always looked tired. My father, always deep in thought, though he rarely shared what troubled him. In that cramped world, I built a space of my own. It wasn't a physical room, but a corner in my mind where I could simply exist. I called it the room inside the room. No walls, no doors, just a place where I didn't need permission to feel. Adults often said I was daydreaming. They made it sound like a fault. But I didn't dream to escape. I dreamed to survive. To imagine a world where people didn't fight over half a banana or argue over whose turn it was to wash a single shirt. I wasn't remarkable. No one remembered my birthdays. No one told stories about my first words or the way I took my first steps. What I had was time, long stretches of being unnoticed. And it was within that silence that I began to remember everything. I recalled the color of my mother's dress the last time she truly laughed. The tension in my father's hands as he read the electricity bill. The moldy smell of rainy nights. The soft exhale just before the lights went out. No one taught me to observe. No one knew I was doing it. But that was how I learned the world, through what was left unsaid. For a while, I thought I might be a shadow, an extension of the room, unseen, unnamed, unneeded. Then one day, sitting outside alone, I overheard an old woman tell my mother, "That boy, there's something strange in his eyes, like he sees more than he should." For the first time, I felt seen, not as a good child or a bad one, but as someone who simply existed with his own awareness. After that, I began to observe myself, how I reacted to being ignored, what I felt when dinner was late, how I processed the small injustices no one else noticed. And I realized, even if the world refuses to see you, you still have the right to see yourself. No one handed me awareness. I found it quietly, in the hours when the entire neighborhood was asleep under the afternoon heat. I won't claim I was special. I only knew this. I could not allow myself to be dissolved. Our house had no windows, but within me, there was always another room where everything was recorded, even if no one ever looked in. More than escaping poverty, I'm not sure when it first appeared, that quiet defiance. It wasn't rebellion, not anger, just a seed of awareness that something out there was waiting for me. At the time, I hadn't even left my neighborhood, had never been to the big market, never seen a bus. I knew nothing about the world across the ocean, but I was sure of one thing. I didn't want to repeat the cycle my father and grandfather had lived. Work hard, stay silent, survive, fade away, be remembered if at all for your patience. I didn't want to be just a good son. I wanted to know what else I could be beyond what poverty had pre-written. At night, listening to my father's weary breathing, I didn't feel sad because we were poor. I felt sad because everyone around me had started to believe that poverty was permanent, that dreams were indulgent, that kids should learn not to hope too much. I heard things like, "Stop dreaming, child. Be grateful if you can eat every day. Dreaming gets you hurt. Learn a trade. Work. That's enough." I understood the fear in those words, but I couldn't accept the idea of discouraging a child just because the adult is tired of disappointment. When I realized I had a sharp memory, when I noticed how easily I connected things others missed, I didn't brag. I wrote, one line at a time, even if the sentences didn't make sense, even if no one would ever read them. I didn't know it was called journaling. I just knew that if I didn't write things down, they would vanish. And maybe those thoughts were the only things I truly owned. For a child with nothing, having something of your own, no matter how intangibly priceless. I had no toys, no private space, but I had an inner world, and I guarded it fiercely. If you happen to be a parent listening to this, I don't expect you to change the way you raise your child. I only ask one thing. Don't silence something in your child just because you don't understand it yet. Sometimes, the quietest kids are the ones carrying the deepest roots. They don't need someone to map the way, just enough space to grow without being labeled odd. That's how I grew, quietly, unnoticed, but unstoppable. I listened when adults talked about getting out, not because I believed them, but because I wanted to know what they believed. To most, escaping poverty meant money. To me, even back then, it meant having the freedom to choose your life. I didn't want to grow up stuck in a job I hated. Didn't want to marry for practicality. Didn't want to live on repeat. I wanted to choose what I studied, what I said, what I stayed silent about, to choose how I responded to struggle. And if I ever made it thou, I could help someone else through it. When you're born into a place where no one expects anything of you, you must be the first person to expect something of yourself. I didn't know where life would take me, but I had already made my decision. I would walk even if I had no map. Where you start isn't where you stay. I was born in the Dominican Republic, a place that most people still have to look up on a map. But I've never been ashamed of that. I didn't choose where my first cry echoed. Didn't choose my parents, the walls around me, or the ceiling that leaked during rain. But I've always believed any starting point can lead to somewhere different if you keep walking. One afternoon, I found a crumpled newspaper near the fish stall. On the front page, a black woman stood tall in a suit, speaking to a crowd. I didn't know who she was, couldn't read the English headline, but I folded the paper carefully and tucked it under my thin pillow. Not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. Someone who looked like me had made it somewhere else. I kept that photo for years. Later, I learned her name, Oprah Winfrey. Her story felt like a quiet whisper reaching even the slums of Santo Domingo. It doesn't matter where you begin. What matters is that you believe in the road ahead. I didn't have books, but I listened. I collected fragments of overheard words from passing adults, shortwave radio buzz, headlines printed on old packaging. Bit by bit, I was drawing a map of my own. The world around me wasn't big, but belief doesn't need space to grow. Just a spark, a thought, a voice that says, "You weren't born to stay still." Years later, I discovered the story of J.K. Rowling. It wasn't the magic that drew me in. It was the image of a struggling woman, broke, with a child in her arms writing at a cafe table. And I thought, if someone with nothing can create a world, maybe I can write one sentence that belongs to me. I believed that long before I knew how to spell. If you're a parent listening to this, I'm not telling you to push your child toward the stars. But if you see something in their eyes, a distant gaze, a hunger beyond your own experience, please don't throw cold water on it just because life once burned you. Your child is not a replica of your fears. They are a second chance to believe again. No one showed me the way, but I had quiet examples like Oprah, Rowling, and Howard Schultz, the Starbucks founder, who once slept in a car before changing the way the world drinks coffee. Years later, I read a Harvard study about resilience. It said that children raised in poverty, but taught to believe in possibilities, often succeed just as much, sometimes more, than those born into comfort. The key wasn't wealth. It was the unshakable belief that you deserve a different future. That belief, I planted it myself. And maybe, if you're still listening to my story today, it's because you're planting it too. For yourself, or for someone small and silent sitting beside you. Where we begin doesn't define us. It simply shows us how far we've come. The struggle between who I was and who I could be. I can't recall the exact moment I realized I was different. It didn't hit like a lightning bolt. It seeped in like water through a leaky roof. Quiet, certain. I watched the kids around me. They ran, yelled, fought over broken toys. I stood on the sidelines not because I felt superior, but because something just didn't fit. I tried. Laughed too loud, kicked the ball, faked tough talk, mimicked the swagger of older boys. Anything to be included. And every time, I felt like a little less of myself. One evening, staring into a cracked mirror, I asked, "Is this really me? Or just a mask I wear so they don't leave me out?" I was too young to know the word identity, but I felt the sting of abandoning truth for the sake of acceptance. The version of me that was quiet, curious, observant, that was called weak. The new version, louder, coarser, tougher, got more nods, more space. One afternoon, I hid behind the house, surrounded by plastic scraps and the smell of mold. I cried soundlessly. No one had hurt me. The pain came from within. I was losing sight of who I was. If you're a parent, and you've seen your child suddenly change their voice, their interests, their energy, please don't rush to correct them. Sometimes, those shifts are signs that the world around them no longer feels safe to be authentic. I used to wish just once that someone would ask, "What do you truly want?" Not, "What should you do?" Not, "What will people say?" No one asked me that. So I began asking myself. I wrote things I couldn't say. Silly questions. Messy feelings. They weren't polished, but they were mine. And that made them matter. The old me wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The pretend version, it got by, but it left a cold emptiness after every smile. I lived in two worlds, one to survive, one to remember who I really was. And somewhere in the tension between the two, I began learning something deeper. Not everyone who feels out of place is wrong. Some of us are just awake inside someone else's dream. You don't need permission to dream big. For a long time, I believed that to dream big, I had to ask someone first. Wait for permission. Hope that someone with authority would say, "Yes, you're allowed." But I was wrong. In my neighborhood, people didn't talk about dreams. They talked about shifts, rain, rice prices. Dreams were a luxury folded up inside a resigned phrase. "We're poor, son. Don't make life harder by dreaming." I heard that line 100 times growing up. It was like a lullaby, except it didn't lead to dreams. It dragged you straight back to the floor. And yet I dreamed anyway. I dreamed of a school with big blackboards and books that smelled like new pages. I dreamed of a teacher who knew my name. I dreamed of a room with light from a lamp and light from someone who understood me. Once, I took an old wooden crate, flipped it upside down, and crawled beneath it. I imagined I was inside a NASA control pod, drew imaginary buttons on the underside of the lid, wrote in my journal, "Someday, I'll reach somewhere they never expected me to." Beneath that table, with smoke from the stove and the scent of mildew in the air, I piloted my own universe. No one knew. No one needed to. And more importantly, I didn't need anyone's permission. That was the moment I realized. The room you're born in is not your cage. It's the launch pad for imagination. Whenever adults tell a child, "Don't dream too big, sweetheart," they don't mean harm. But that sentence acts like an invisible lock fastened onto a door that grown-ups have forgotten how to open. If you're a parent, listen closely. Your child may sit for hours with a block of wood and see in it an entire world. Just don't laugh. Don't snatch it away in the name of cleaning up. Don't sever the string connecting their small hands to something so much bigger. I don't blame those who once put out the spark in me. They didn't mean to. They'd just been extinguished too many times themselves. They feared my hope would hurt me. But I'd rather be hurt by dreaming than live safely in a world I never believed in. The biggest lesson I ever learned in that windowless house was this: you don't need permission to dream big. You just need to remember that you once did. The whispers in the night. It was one of those humid afternoons, the kind that made everything stick. I had said something different in class, an idea no one asked for. And after school, a few older boys surrounded me behind the shed. They didn't hit hard. They just wanted me to stop. Stop asking strange questions. Stop writing in that little notebook. Stop being the boy who made others uncomfortable by simply thinking differently. No one stopped them. The adults were washing clothes. The other kids just watched or laughed. When it was over, I walked home. My mother was asleep. My father still at work. I didn't go inside. I didn't cry. I walked barefoot through muddy paths soaked by a light rain earlier. And eventually, I found myself crouched beside an old abandoned shop at the edge of the alley. It had once sold drinks. Now it sold silence. I sat there, back pressed against the damp brick. Not crying, not thinking, just still. In that stillness, I heard something. Not the crickets or the dogs. something softer, something inside me. If no one comes, what will you do next? No one had spoken, but the question echoed. I didn't have an answer, only the sense that I had crossed into a place without direction. And if I didn't learn to move, I'd stay lost whether or not I went home. Years later, I would call that moment hitting bottom. But back then, I was just a child, one no one noticed, feeling for the first time that the world could be cold and quiet and entirely indifferent. If you're a parent, and one evening your child is quieter than usual, please don't ask, "Were you good today?" Ask this instead: did anything today make you feel small? Because sometimes children don't need advice. They just need to know someone sees the smallness they're carrying like a secret. I stayed there until nightfall. Then I stood, walked home. No one asked where I'd been, but I knew that was the night I learned how to walk out of fear without waiting for someone to take my hand. Small worlds, deep roots. I used to believe that to become someone valuable, I had to go far. Leave this place. Study somewhere bigger. Live a life that expanded well beyond the crumbling walls I'd grown up with. But after that night, the night I sat alone beneath the rusted roof, I started noticing the little things around me. And I realized something. Greatness doesn't always need a wide world. Sometimes, it only needs the right soil to grow deep. I didn't have a library. No shiny books. But I had an old sewing box my mother used to keep her threads. That became my desk. Every night, I'd open it, pull out scraps of paper I'd found, and write. My handwriting was crooked. The spelling was off. No one would have understood it. But I wrote anyways if it was the only thing keeping me from disappearing. Our home was tiny, just big enough for 3 people to eat sitting shoulder to shoulder. Just wide enough to sleep without turning. Just tall enough that if I forgot to duck, I'd hit my head on the beam. Yet within that narrow space, I learned how to read emotion. I saw how my father fell silent when my mother sighed. How our old neighbor dropped a slice of ginger into my mother's soup without saying a word. How the boy next door took my worn-out sandals and quietly returned them 3 days later. No one taught lessons on kindness. No one lectured on resilience. But I learned all of it through the smallest movements in the smallest of places. One rainy week, I wrote something in my journal, a sentence that stayed with me for decades. A tree doesn't need a forest to grow tall. It needs deep roots. If you're a parent and you're worried because you can't give your child a good school, a private room, or a picture-perfect future, please don't blame yourself. Because the greatest thing a child needs is not square footage but depth. And that depth doesn't come from textbooks. It comes from listening when your child says something unusual and not shutting it down. It comes from seeing more than a scribble when they write on the wall. It comes from believing that sometimes the smallest rooms hold the richest soil, if we're willing to let the roots take hold. Finding a new way to see. Nothing around me had changed. The house was still small. The walls still cracked. The roof still leaked when it rained. Voices still argued. Dinner was still thin. My father still sighed when he came home late and tired. But somehow, I began to see it all differently. Not because someone rescued me. Not because I suddenly had new opportunities. But because for the first time I chose to see the world with different eyes. Before, I stared at the ceiling to escape. Now, I looked at it to understand. to find patterns, to imagine that even this old room could be something else. I gave it names of my own. I started noticing the things no one spoke about. The smell of damp soil when the rain paused. The light leaking through a hole in the roof like it was trying to find me. The rhythm of my mother's sewing machine, like a quiet drum announcing the day's arrival. I wasn't escaping anymore through imagination. I was redesigning the reality around me, reframing it, reshaping it with every word I scribbled, every story I built silently. I couldn't change my circumstances, but I could change how I named them. It was no longer a slum. It was an emotional laboratory, not a prison of poverty, but a waiting station for great ideas. As a child, the most powerful transformation isn't physical. It's when you realize you have the right to choose how you see the world. No one applauded this change. No one asked me what I was thinking. But deep inside, I knew I was not the same boy anymore. It wasn't a dramatic rebirth. It was a quiet awakening, a whisper inside that said, "You don't need to be rescued. If you can look at where you are and decide to live differently, starting now." If you're raising a child, you may not see their changes as they happen. But trust me, the biggest transformations happen in silence. In the moments they sit alone without words. In the nights they toss and turn but never complain. In the scribbled lines you don't understand. But that might just be the first map of a soul learning how to redraw its world. The sound of a different kind of birth. Some people are born once, from the womb, with a cry, with warm arms waiting, and eyes filled with hope. I wasn't. My first birth came without welcome. Just the sound of water dripping from a leaky roof, and the fading warmth of a mother too tired to speak. I was placed into the world, no ceremony, no preparation, but I was born again. Not from blood and body, but from an idea. One night, after scribbling a sentence into my journal no one would ever read, I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow, I will live differently." Not waiting to be understood, not needing permission, just remembering who I am. That was my second birth. It didn't come with sound. It came with silent resolve in a boy not yet 8. No one saw it happen. But from that moment, I knew. I wasn't just the product of my circumstances. I was the one continuing the story. From then on, even though I still lived under a sagging roof, even though dinner was still water and rice, I saw everything differently. Not as a helpless child surrounded by poverty, but as someone learning how to live deeply in a world that felt shallow. You don't need to change everything to begin again. Sometimes, you just need to change the way you listen to yourself, and the world begins to shift from within. That was my second birth. Quiet, but powerful enough to change everything that came next. And then one day, my mother held my hand tightly and said, "We're leaving this place." I looked up at the gray skies of Dominica, and for the first time, I asked myself, in a different place, could I be fully myself from the very beginning? I didn't know what America was, didn't know who I'd meet, but inside I felt it clearly. A door was about to open, and I was ready to walk through.
Hello everyone, I'm Lily, the youngest daughter of Victor Dominic. My father shared these stories, not to be remembered, but to remind us. Everyone deserves a new beginning, even the broken ones. Some names and places have been changed for privacy, but Free Your Soul is real, and it's the most precious legacy he left us. Today, I'm sharing it with you, hoping it reaches someone who needs a quiet, gentle whisper. Thank you for listening with your heart. I'll see you in the next stories.